Well, we are in the studio again here at the University of the Pacific. My name is Dr. Mary Lomax-Ghirarduzzi, and this is Humanizing Us, a podcast around identity and the ways that our identity really informs who we've become and who we are becoming. And it's also a way for us to think about these issues of equity, identity, belonging, as ways of thinking about how to be more human in the world, and so thus humanizing us. And I am so excited to be in the studio today with a woman that I met actually this year, and during the spring, I believe it was, during a award ceremony for women in the not only in the university community, but the community that were doing spectacular things. And Professor Ederlina Co is a professor of law here at the University of the Pacific's McGeorge School of Law. She teaches global lawyering skills 1 and 2. She's also teaches the prisoner civil rights mediation clinic. Actually, I believe that's the actual clinic. She's going to tell us about that. And she's also teaches reproductive rights and justice. I had a really wonderful opportunity to spend some time with Professor Co. I think it might have been within the last month, with the unfortunate overturning of the Roe v. Wade. She was one of the first scholars that I personally was able to spend time with, and we provided just a platform for her to share what the meaning of that is, particularly from the lens of those that would be most harmed, and the implications of that legal ruling. But she's also a member of not only the California bar, but she's also a member of the DC bar. That's the District of Columbia. And so pretty phenomenal, really bright, and woman who's a scholar, and as well as someone that I'm just so pleased just to be able to be in your presence, and just to be able now to call you a colleague and a friend. And one of the things that we've been doing, and if it's okay if I call you Ederlina?
Yes, please.
Ederlina, is that I wanted to launch this podcast because I believe that we are being called now to be more human in the world in ways that perhaps we may not fully understand what that means. Before we began this session, you had made a comment to one of the students here that now is a time for people to be thinking about going into the law, and that the law itself really needs great minds, and obviously not just great minds, but I would also say people with great hearts and people that are seeking, to do good in the world. And so I think one of the things that I like to, pose to you in this kind of opening question is, what led you in your path to becoming a professor of law? And you could begin that, storytelling any way that you want to, but thinking about your own identity itself, how you identify. Obviously, we know you professionally as a professor of law. I know that you're a mother. I know we're both mothers of 2 girls. Mm-hmm. But I think there's more to the story around how you chose to even focus and on the areas that I first came to really kind of delve deeply with you, which was on issues of reproductive rights and justice. And there's just so much more that I'm still learning about you. And I just wanted to give both you and, our listening audience an opportunity just to hear a little bit more about your story.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me, and for that very packed question. So many things have led me to where I am now. Mm-hmm. I would say, since we're at the University of the Pacific, and I so rarely get to spend time on the undergraduate campus, maybe I'll start there. Mm-hmm. I distinctly remember going to an event with a panel of public interest lawyers. And I knew I was interested in the law, but I didn't know exactly what type of law I wanted to pursue. But it was interesting to me, right? The rules that we as a society have to follow. And a woman on the panel, her name is Kelly Evans. She worked for the ACLU, and she was talking about her career. And she started at an organization called Equal Rights Advocates. And she told the story of how the organization was involved in taking on the San Francisco Fire Department and forcing them by law and through a lawsuit to allow women to become firefighters. And this was within my lifetime. And I thought it was absurd that if women wanted to be firefighters, they couldn't be. But that this organization had brilliantly used the law to change that so that women could participate in that type of employment if they wanted to and were qualified to do so. And as soon as she finished her talk, I thought, I'm going to go intern and work for that organization. And so the next day I called them and I said, I'd really like to work with your organization. I think the work you do is really impactful. It's interesting. And I'd love to get more exposure to the kind of law that you practice. And so I joined the organization as an intern or college intern and was exposed to some of the most brilliant lawyers, thinkers, and women that I could have ever imagined. And so much of my pursuit of women's rights and then ultimately reproductive rights started in that moment in a classroom with a lawyer who had no idea the impact that she was going to have on me until about 2 years ago. I knew she was speaking at a bar association event in Sacramento, and I said, I'm going. And I went up to her at the reception hour and I said, you have no idea who I am, but I want to tell you how impactful you've been in my life. And I told her, you were an attorney at the ACLU, and now I think she's working for the governor.
Yes.
But you were an attorney at the ACLU. You gave a talk at UC Berkeley, and I was in that audience. And ever since then, this is how my career path has gone. And so thank you. I'm incredibly grateful that you took that time to share your career path with students. And so incidentally, I was recently, a student at UC Berkeley had reached out to me last week and said, I'm part of a student organization. Would you be interested in joining a panel with women's rights lawyers? And it's from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, I think, on a Friday night. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so late. And I thought, oh my gosh, of course I would be. This is the exact pay it forward moment that you've been waiting for. So that's sort of how it all started.
Wow. That's a great story. I love that. You know, you put your finger on a very specific engagement where your formation, you know, because you were already a college student, so you were already thinking about these things. And, you know, it's safe to say that issues of gender rights is clearly has been a part of your calling, a part of your professional path. Talk a little bit about, you know, some of your earlier experiences that have that were gender influence or gender centric or gender informed that may have been you know, kind of like the they say, you know, these things that happen to you and you look back, as you just looked back on this, are indicators of of what has always been inside of you. You know, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more, maybe even some early experiences that were gender informed that impacted you.
I mean, there's no question, right, that being raised predominantly by my mom while my dad was living in the Philippines, that was a tremendous influence in what I saw growing up, and both in terms of what women could be in society and everything that they could do, but also in terms of some of the challenges that they would face. And so even at a very young age, I wouldn't say I was thinking, oh, I'm going to go into women's rights and I see all this inequality. But I do think it has an impression on you as you grow up, both in good ways, but also in ways that make you think critically about, is this is this right? Is there something that why is this so hard for some people and not others? And I think it probably influenced my education path. So when I started college, when my counselors would ask me, well, what kind of classes are you interested in? And, with general ed, you take history, you take political science and all of these things, but there were courses that had an emphasis on the history of women or the sociology of women or the psychology of women. And I thought, that's interesting. Sure, I'll take those. And slowly but surely, I got a very solid and in-depth education about women in society and the way that women have flourished, but also the challenges that they have faced. And I've always thought, that's not right. And some people, right, they see injustices and they say, okay, well, that's just the way it is. And for me, it was a calling, right? It was I'm going to do what I can with my life to make this better.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the choices that you've made professionally that are informed by those early experiences, whether it be for the, experiences with your mother, and the influence that she had on you. You mentioned your father was, sounds like for a period of time, away in the Philippines. Those choices that you ended up making, particularly around the Prisoner Civil Rights Mediation Clinic, and maybe you can describe what that is, and even the choices around the reproductive rights and justice, and you've given us a clue already. There's still things that you can choose, even as you're focused on gender justice issues. How did those things really emerge as kind of pathways for you?
So it's funny when I look at my career, if I'm asked to update my bio on the website and I look at my career, and I think some people think, oh, that's a very linear career. And it really wasn't. It was sort of what my life was dictating at the time, as well as how could I get my interests to intersect with that all at the same time. And so the Prisoner Civil Rights Mediation Clinic is a clinic at McGeorge that students participate in. And so let me step back. There are about 30 prisons, 32 prisons in the state of California, and most of them are housed in the eastern side of California. And so the federal courts in Sacramento and Fresno get a lot of prisoner civil rights cases, and those courts are heavily impacted by those cases, and they're overwhelmed by the volume. And McGeorge administrators were sitting with federal judges and said, how could we help? And they said, well, maybe you could help with the prisoner civil rights caseload. And it began, sort of figuring out, well, how could we participate in that? And they were interested in seeing, could we try and settle some of these cases or mediate them in a way that the parties would be equally satisfied and not having to pursue the litigation for 2 years, 3 years, 10 years. How could we resolve some of these cases? And they thought, well, why don't we try alternative dispute resolution or mediation? And so students get involved we get assigned cases from the court, and then students work on those cases. They go out to the prison, or they, meet via Zoom or telephone with the plaintiff, and they talk about his case, and they prepare him to come into court and ultimately engage or participate in a mediation settlement conference with the state. And if they can settle their claims in a way that's satisfactory to them and as well as to the state, then the cases are settled. So that's how students participate. In terms of how I got involved in it, for about 9.5 years, I worked at the federal courthouse and I worked on these cases. And so my expertise, in addition to reproductive rights, is in prisoner civil rights. And it wasn't, if you would have asked me at any point before that, is that an area of law that you would be interested in? I would have said no. I have no interest in that. And I'm more interested in the gender space. But it just so happened I moved back to California to be close from Washington, D.C. I moved back to California to be closer to family.
This is after you finished law school. You finished law school at Georgetown Law Center, where you got your JD.
And so I spent some time in Washington, D.C., but when I needed to be back in California, that job was an opening. And the judge said, would you be interested in doing this? And I wasn't sure, but I needed a job. And it was a great job, it turned out. And I would have never guessed that I would have spent a decade of my life working on these cases. But it was so important to me it was important to me to know that regardless of your status, right? If you are a prisoner, you're a convicted felon, regardless of that status, if you're filing a civil rights case in court, that you get a fair shake from whoever's reviewing those cases. And so for me, it was a privilege and an honor to be part of the administration of justice from that side.
So, Professor Co, what you're telling me is that you, for a period of almost 10 years, and you still continue even in your professor role through the clinic, that you took on cases for a sector of society that, for the most part, people do not even see their humanity anymore. Not only have they lost their ability, to obviously be free in society because, they're in the carceral state, but oftentimes they've lost so many other rights. And so you're using your legal skills and your calling to essentially, fight for the civil rights of a group of people that society has pretty much agreed to that they're throw away. Tell me, what are some of the greatest things around, what did you learn through those experiences about the human parts of how we lose that even in our systems?
Right. So let me say two things about that. I think the greatest thinkers of our time would all agree that how you treat the most vulnerable citizens in society, whether it's the elderly, children, or people who are locked up in prison because they are at the complete discretion of the state and the government. How you treat these vulnerable people in society is a reflection of your society, right? Not the richest people, how are they doing, but really, how do we treat them? And that resonates deeply with me. And then in terms of, I forget the other question.
No, but that's a profound response. How do we treat those that are at the margins, the deepest margins, or as Derek Bell would say, Professor Derek Bell, those that are at the bottom of the well in society?
Right. Oh, and the other piece I would say that I learned I wish I could say I learned it sooner, but I would say over the course of time, at some point, it really dawned on me that we cannot treat people as whatever their worst mistake is, right? I wouldn't want to be judged by my worst mistake or treated day in and day out based on that. Yes, they are incarcerated and they are serving their time for the mistake that they made, but otherwise they are still human. And at least our Constitution protects that.
Absolutely.
So I considered it, again, a privilege and an honor to be part of that administration of justice.
That's a deeply humanizing statement and a value that it seems like it guides you and it guides your work. This idea that you can tell so much about a society, you can tell so much about a people, you can tell so much about an institution by how it regards those that have been left out and have been, in many cases, oppressed and marginalized. Where do you think that comes from when you think back?
I wish I knew, because I wish I were able to bottle it and give it to others, right? This idea that if you see injustices, you're motivated to contribute in a way that can improve those injustices, or if not erase them completely. And I don't know where it comes from, except that it is a calling. And I think we all have a calling. It may just be that is mine.
Yes.
Because if you have a law degree, you can do any number of things, right? You can certainly take a path that is going to make your life incredibly comfortable and financially secure. You can take another path that's going to allow you to feed your soul and allow you to contribute to society in a way that makes you feel great at the end of the day. I tried to do X, I tried to do Y.
So it's important to share, though, with the audience as well, that they know that you are also a pro tem judge. And that is someone who is a lawyer, and the requirements, make sure I get this right, that you need to be a lawyer for at least 10 years, which you have and are, and is trained for small claims cases that can easily take the place of a regular judge. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate.
Okay. So talk to us about how the pro tem judge piece fits into this construct of justice that you're engaged in. As you know, you're a legal scholar. I engage you as a legal scholar, but also we're also engaging you as a lawyer and as somebody that is also a judge. Talk to us a little bit about, how that fits into this whole piece of kind of like living and being a more humanizing person through the fields that you've been called to.
Yeah, so that is also a privilege and an honor to sit on the bench in Sacramento. And part of it is because there are so few women and people of color on the bench that drew me to that. Because I think it does make a difference in terms of not just the perspective that you bring to the bench, but also in terms of the people that are appearing before you to see that, okay, we have people that look like us in these positions that are going to be making these decisions. And so a lot of that drew me to volunteering and allowing this to be sort of my pro bono work of the month. And it's interesting, right? It's interesting as an educator, someone who is teaching future lawyers. It gives me a touch point. Yes. I think in academia, you can get really isolated among people who oftentimes think like you, who have resources like you.
You could call them echo chambers.
Yes, exactly. But they're not ordinary people. They're not people with ordinary legal problems and disputes. And so when I sit as a judge, it gives me a touch point with people who are outside of academia. And importantly to me, it gives me the opportunity to practice a lot of the skills that I'm teaching students, which was also important to me. For me, when I teach global lawyering skills and I tell my students or I teach my students, here's how we do the legal research, here's how we do the legal analysis, I want to be doing that same skill or exercising or practicing those same skills so that I'm current, as opposed to, sometimes if you get into academia, you can get so immersed in your scholarship and just your teaching that you lose some of that skill set because you've been away for a while. So judging has given me the opportunity to have all of those benefits, right? Not only, performing a service for my community, but also having a touch point with ordinary people and ordinary legal disputes, as well as practicing the skill sets that I'm teaching my students.
So you're a legal educator and a legal scholar, and you're taking these theoretical frameworks and analytical frameworks, and by the practical piece of the judge piece is almost like you put in what, my field, we call a theory to practice in some ways. Something you said that I want to dig a little bit more in, particularly in the role that you have, the pro tem for the Sacramento County Superior Court. You said when you're there, I would imagine on the bench, that people that are before you, that you're overseeing their case, and then everybody else who's in the courtroom, whether they are witnesses or they're playing some part, in the judicial process, whatever that is, they get to see someone that looks like them. So as you're thinking, what role does representation play? And the work that you do, not just as a legal educator in the classroom, that's where I know you originally, but in thinking about your representation as a judge in Sacramento, one of the most diverse communities in the state of California.
Right. I think because of that diversity, it is important for people in the community to come in and see themselves in these positions of power. And that's what it is. It is a position of power, because you are entrusted, or I am entrusted, to make decisions that are highly consequential in people's lives. And so I think when people come into the courthouse, if they see, okay, this is an institution that also values diversity, and fairness that comes with that they are more likely to trust in the process, that they are more likely to feel as though they were heard, and they are more likely to accept the outcome.
You said something about diversity, and oftentimes people, they approach diversity from I say from a very simplistic perspective. And so much of diversity is about helping people see themselves in the very parts of society, i.e. institutions, that are also part of their life, and it sounds like it's so simplistic, but it's so significant. This idea of the power of representation, I still say this all the time. I said, do you know what the power of representation can do? It can transform the lives, not only of those that see themselves, but the other ones that may not see themselves exactly, but then they can recognize that the world is inclusive of a lot of different people. And I always say, gosh, if we just understood the power of representation, then institutions would probably work even harder to ensure that all the children, that all the people are able to find themselves in whatever the positions are. The power of representation has to be a part of your work, whether it's formal or informal. How do you approach this idea of representation, even as a legal scholar and as a teacher? And you're working with the next generation of lawyers, judges, whatever area that they choose to go to. You're helping them to think about who they can become. What do you think is the power of representation in the classroom that you bring?
I underestimate it. And I learn every semester how much I underestimate it, because it usually comes to me in my student evaluations that, a student will write, I can't tell you how important it was for me to see a woman of color professor. You were one of my only female professors, if not my only female professor, and you were my only person of color who was also a professor. And that makes a huge difference, to be able to see someone in that role at the podium, that they too can aspire to that, right? There is a point of entry for them too. And I underestimate it all the time, because I'm just doing my job, right? I'm doing my job. I'm aware, but I'm mainly doing my job, and insofar as I can, doing it in a way that is above. I try to do it in a way that makes it easier for people who are coming up behind me.
It's both a responsibility.
Yeah.
It's a responsibility that many of us that are the first, or maybe not enough of, we carry with us.
Right. It is a privilege to be in all of these positions, as an attorney, as a judge, as a professor. But it comes with a responsibility.
It sure does. And we think about them. I would imagine you think about that responsibility.
Yeah, certainly. Because I try not to too much, otherwise it can get overwhelming. But
yeah, and it could be, for some people, as we've seen, it can be debilitating, where it impacts them.
Right. But if you're the first, or if you're the only, in at least in some students' lives, even if not on campus, if you're the first or the only, you realize that you are under a certain level of scrutiny, which can be good and bad, but you are under a certain level of scrutiny, and I don't want to make a mistake or an error that would jeopardize an opportunity for someone coming up behind me.
Absolutely. That level of accountability, that's what I call that. It's like a personal accountability that we have, that society puts upon us unknowingly or knowingly, that as a a professional scholar, a woman of color in your field, that you're at the top of your game, and I can only imagine where you're going to end up continuing going. That type of accountability can also, drive you and lead you to do even greater things. Tell me a little bit about what you kind of see happening for yourself in the future. What might happen? What are some things that when you start to think of becoming, really becoming Ederlina, fully becoming Ederlina, what are some things that you see in your future?
Oh, wow. I feel like I've become Ederlina in a really, and it only in the last couple of years. I mean, I'm so grateful. I should say I'm so grateful for that. But when I'm having conversations like this one, and people say, you're an attorney, you're a judge, you're a professor, sometimes I think, who are you talking about? You're talking about me, which is wonderful. About you. Right? And so in many ways, I've accomplished a lot of what, I would have even thought about in my wildest dreams. And I think my goal at this point is just to continue contributing. Obviously, we're experiencing an incredibly challenging moment for people who support reproductive rights. And so for me, that is where I'm channeling a lot of energy and all of the experiences that I've had and all of the things that I've gained and developed and honed in on as I've moved from, college to law school to practice to all of these different experiences. How can I bring and channel all of that into supporting a movement forward on these issues?
So the time that we're in, a time such as this, where we are experiencing the early days of being what I call the early days of post-Roe, as we've known it before, is going to create new challenges, but it also will create new opportunities because there's always opportunities in these spaces. As you're becoming, even more of who you are in these various kind of like, there's other roles, but let's talk about the attorney, the professor, and the judge. And as you already bring the expertise that you're bringing as a legal thinker and scholar and professor around reproductive rights and justice, and I just want to mention a piece that you and I talked about in the last conversation that we had, where you wrote for the Rutgers Law Review, which was just recently published this past fall of 2021. You introduced a concept that was called abortion privilege, which is also the name of the title of your article. Talk a little bit about how you becoming more of who you are through the lens of looking at the greatest issues of our time, which is going to continue to be reproductive rights and justice. Talk a little bit about what abortion privilege is and really how you see that this is an important way for you to kind of bring your brilliance and your experience into the world.
Yeah, so a lot has been written about reproductive rights and about abortion from both ends of the spectrum and sort of everything in between. And at the time that I wrote Abortion Privilege, abortion was still a constitutional right. But what it means to be a constitutional right versus, what it means to be law in paper versus law in actuality in people's lives is different. By its very nature, constitutional law is negative. So it just means, okay, if you have the constitutional right to abortion, it means the government can't interfere with that. But it doesn't mean that you have the right to be supported in that decision. It doesn't mean that if you're someone who is low income, that the government will support you with Medicaid funds. And so there is always this gulf that exists between legal rights and how people practice or have access to those legal rights in society. And for me, the way that I looked at the abortion issue in that article was to say there are some people who everybody in theory had these legal rights, but there are only some people who can actually practice them. And to me, that was a way to, use privilege and the discussion around privilege in this particular context. And even when you think about now, after the Dobbs decision, not having a constitutional right, it's going to exacerbate that privilege. Even if you live in a state where abortion is illegal, if you have the means, you will certainly be able to travel. So privilege is going to come up in a number of different ways, and we see it now.
Already
playing out. Exactly.
So the reproductive rights piece, the continuing your work with the civil rights for those that are currently incarcerated, that are bringing cases forward around their own civil rights issues. What else do you see, or any other things that might be on the horizon for you?
Professionally, just more of the same.
More of the same, but more of the same.
More of the same, but hopefully bringing new perspective to it, different ways of looking at the issues. Obviously, doing responding to what's going on in society now, but more of the same.
More of the same.
I feel very grateful in that I can look back on my career and feel as though I did everything I could to contribute to make things better. Even with reproductive rights, even with the seminal Roe versus Wade being overturned in my lifetime, I don't look back on my career and think what a failure, or what a disappointment. I mean, I look back and I think I'm so grateful that I had an opportunity to hold that line as long as we did. And now it's an opportunity, an unfortunate one, but it is an opportunity to think, okay, when you look at Roe versus Wade and you look at the way that privilege existed even when there was a constitutional right, now we have an opportunity. We can build this up in the way that we want it to look, right?
There might be a little bit of patchwork state by state.
Yeah. And so there's something about that too, that I think a lot of people, if you would have asked them in the reproductive rights space or reproductive justice space, what do you think is going to happen with Dobbs? There were people who were very concerned and said, I don't want Dobbs to be overturned. I'll take the shell of Roe versus Wade being maintained. And there were others who said, they need to overturn Roe versus Wade because we need to start anew. And you can see that even though Roe versus Wade has been overturned, it doesn't look that different for a lot of people. In the South, for example, where abortion had become so restricted.
Even when the constitutional right was still in place.
Right.
And it maybe help our viewers understand, or listeners understand why it was difficult even before the Dobbs decision that just happened this past June.
Right. Exactly. I mean, the state law that was at issue in Dobbs was Mississippi. Mississippi had one abortion clinic in their state, and that was it. And it was, if you were going to elect that procedure, you had to jump through a number of hoops to do so. And that isn't starkly different from now. So, there's a lot of thinking and there's a lot of work that needs to be done immediately and long term.
When you think of the term humanizing us, what does that mean to you?
I think humanizing us, I think it means treating people with dignity, seeing them as human beings first and not as their worst mistake. I think it means, it comes up in the work that I do, right? So for prisoner civil rights, it is treating someone as human is not, I'm going to just focus on this mistake that you made 20 years ago. In the reproductive rights space, treating someone as human means trusting that they can make the decision that is right for them. That's what it means to be human to me, is just accepting that not everybody is like you and everybody has something to contribute and offer to help our society flourish. if we allow them to do it and give them the space and the resources and support to do it.
Wow. If we want to find out more about your work, what are some places that you suggest the listening audience go to?
The McGeorge website.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They will have all of my, access to all of my writing, access to podcasts like this, and they will be the ones who know where I'll be speaking or where I have spoken on different issues, whether it's related to reproductive rights or related to diversity, equity, inclusion, or related to prisoner civil rights. Absolutely.
So Professor Ederlina Co, Professor of Law at the University of the Pacific's McGeorge School of Law, a lawyer, a legal scholar, a judge, and a woman of extreme character, integrity, and brilliance. What a pleasure it is to be able to be in the studio with you today here on the beautiful Stockton campus of the University of the Pacific. The team here has enjoyed every moment with you. I know that we all have enjoyed the time that we've been here with you. I am just looking forward to the work that we are going to do together.
Absolutely.
Anything you do, I want to be associated with it.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much.